Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Deep Humanism. I'm your host, James Croft. I'm here for Two Humanists, as always, with Andrew Copson. How are you doing, Andrew?
I'm very well.
I'm glad to hear it. We have a slightly different format for you today because usually we explore two topics, but today we're just going to explore one because we're doing a deep dive into a new report that released over the last week from the Bible Society. Now, this report, called Quiet Revival, has been really exciting people all up and down in the media internationally. I've seen reports on it. Everyone's very excited about what it might mean for the future of Christianity and church going in the United Kingdom. And because there's been so much commentary about it, we thought we'd do a deep dive into that report. And to tee us up, I thought I'd just introduce you to what it is in case you haven't read it or heard of it. You don't have any idea of what it is. So the Bible Society is an organisation in the United Kingdom that exists to promote the study of the Bible and Christian worship in general. It is an evangelistic Christian organisation, and it also funds research into people's opinions about the Bible, about religion, about Christianity, etc. We'll come back to the source of this report later because it's kind of important to keep in mind who's publishing this, who's doing the research, and who's writing it up, and what their agenda is. But what they have done is in 2024, so last year, they did a study done by a polling company called YouGov, which is a very well-respected research and polling organisation, of 13,146 adults weighted to be representative to the British population. And then they asked them all sorts of questions about, what do you think about God? What do you think about religion and Christianity in particular? How often do you go to church? And all these sorts of questions about their well-being and things like that. And then they have written up the results of that study into this report. Now, this report follows a report 6 years ago that came out in 2018, where they did a similar survey of over 10,000 adults. That was just under 20,000 in that case, so it was even a bigger study. And so they are sort of comparing their results from 6 years ago to their results from last year. And they've come up with some pretty dramatic conclusions. Now, I would say that the report has broadly two strands of takeaways. One of them is about the benefits of going to church and participating in religion for people, which they write a chunk about how good it is for people to go to church and be a member of a congregation. There's been a lot of research about that, and we can talk a little bit about that. But the thing that's been making the headlines is the claim that a quiet revival is sweeping the UK church, driven by increasing church going among young people, particularly among young men. And I want to read a section of the report for you because this is how it opens. In churches across society, something amazing is happening, challenging long-held predictions about the future of Christianity in the 21st century. Where once we saw aging congregations and a steady decline in attendance, we see dramatic growth led by the young. Where once we saw apathy or even hostility to Christianity and the Bible, we see increased openness again among the young. So they're very, very excited about this report. They've got big claims for it, and we're going to investigate if those claims are supported by the evidence. So what was your first thought about this report, Andrew?
Well, I have developed a particular dislike for this narrative over the last few years because it's a perennial sort of narrative. Every 20 years or so, everyone who has got a sort of Christian drum to bang, and it is usually Christian revival we're talking about here, says there's a revival. That's it, everyone. Hockey stick. We're back. Everything's coming back.
We're so back.
Yeah, we're so back. And I was reading, Humanist UK has recently merged with an old organisation called the Rationalist Association, which has published a magazine called New Humanist for 140 years. And I was looking through the archive because it's really good. They've got the whole New Humanist archive digitised online. So you can see magazines, and I was looking at the 1920s and the 1940s, and in both magazines in the 20s and the 40s, they were responding to the Christian revival claims. Christians were saying, we're back, people are going to church again, and, and someone else has changed their mind. Often it's linked to, famous famous atheist rationalist humanists changing their mind and seeing or secular people as it is now, and seeing the light. So there's always lots of celebrity cases of this, and then they try and sort of create a stampede, really, these evangelists in their direction, which is fine. I mean, Christians want to persuade other people to be Christians, right? That's one of the things that they do, and I understand that. I have no objection to them doing it in a free society. But it always seemed that this was really quite duplicitous, and that the sort of evidence that they were offering for a revival here, a revival there, a revival somewhere, was not really very convincing. You know, Russell Brand becoming a Christian, who was held out there, you know, as part of the revival, or like, you know, online influences. This does not make a revival. But at the same time, of course, I've always realised that in history there have been revivals. Of course, there was a revival at the elite level in this country of Christianity in the sort of 1950s, when they, you know, felt that it was important to promote Christianity again. That was a mini revival. That was only 70 years ago. And of course, there was a Christian revival in the early 19th century after the challenge of the Enlightenment. There was a sort of Christian revival in England at that point, sponsored by the government, you know, and as a reaction to the French Revolution and the Enlightenment and all the things that were seen to challenge orthodoxy and the elite. So, you know, religious revivals are possible. But I've always thought that this was over-egged and, you know, frankly, as I say, duplicitous. But this is the first data I've seen which indicate undisputably that there is something happening. And it is obviously the case, and like you say, this is YouGov's reputable, but you don't just have to rely on the reputation of YouGov. You can see the sample's pretty large. The data, therefore, is relatively robust. And, of course, the most particularly striking data is that the number of people claiming to go to church on at least a monthly basis has increased dramatically. But so I thought, okay, this is actually something. There's something happening here. You know, this is interesting. But then, and you and I have already spoken about this, my colleague at Humanist UK, a very data-driven colleague, very focused colleague who likes to look into data and is very good at it, looked into this a bit, and this was the first point at which I realised that this apparent data that supported an alleged tiny revival wasn't really that reliable. He pointed out that this is self-reported data in a survey. So this is what people say if you ask them, how often do you go to church, okay? So it is a claim. People are claiming that they go to church once a month or whatever. But you don't need to rely actually on people's self-reported church attendance, because the Catholic Church and the Church of England themselves measure how many people go to their churches, which of course is, unlike self-reported church attendance, an objective measure of church attendance. And he found that it was literally unbelievable that the number of people that this survey that the Bible Society commissioned said were going to church were actually going to church. So if these percentages were true, then monthly attendance at churches would have gone from about 3.5 million 7 years ago to almost 6 million last year. And the Church of England specifically would have gone from 1.5 million to 2 million. But the Church of England's own figures, which unlike this survey data are objective because they count attendance in churches, show that that is simply not the case. So there may be more people going to church than there were a few years ago, and indeed there may well be more 18 to 24-year-olds going to church than the generation before them did when they were 18 to 24. But the real question, the real change has been an increase in the number of people claiming to go to church, really, because it is simply unbelievable, and the statistics show that it is in fact impossible that the number of people who are claiming in this survey to go to church actually do so. So nonetheless, that's interesting. It's interesting that young men aged 18 to 24 feel that it is socially desirable to say they go to church, and therefore say that in a survey. So we could look into that, and maybe we'll discuss that. But that was the first thing that made me think, okay, maybe my belief in these figures, actually, I can happily return to my prior convictions, which are correct all along. Everyone likes that. I can dismiss it. Everyone likes that. And then the second thing, I thought, even if these data are true, this still counts as, by almost any measure, one of the least religious generations in English history. So, I mean, even if this data is accurate, which, as I say, it isn't, because you can tell it isn't by just measuring it against objective data, even if this data were accurate, it was still not representing in any meaningful sense a revival. And as this report itself shows that there is an ongoing reduction in the number of people in the population as a whole who say that they're Christian, who have Christian beliefs, and so on and so forth. So I think we shouldn't get too excited about it. Though I think it might be an interesting question, as I say, to ask why these people claiming to go to church if they're not. What is it that makes that seem desirable?
Yes.
And given that there must be some sort of increase in that age group, that's highly, that's a bit that could be true. There is some increase in that lower age group. There is an interesting question as to why that might be, and we might get into that as well. Because if there is a growing search for meaning amongst young people, or just the endless search for meaning that everyone always has, I suppose it might be that churches are beginning to appeal to, specifically, as we say in this report, young men in new ways, and that might be interesting in itself too, but it is not a revival.
I love that response. So comprehensive, so many good things to pick up. The first, I've got kind of three things that you made me think of there. The first is the big picture about when you're talking about this narrative of a revival happening periodically. It's obviously the case that, broadly speaking, Christians, and particularly Christian organizations like the Bible Society, which literally exists to promote people engaging with the Bible and becoming Christians, want there to be a Christian revival. They're heavily invested in a particular outcome of this research, and that affects how they look at their figures and how they present the figures. And we've always got to keep that in the back of our minds. The second thing that you pointed to is the fact that this is self-report data. Now, to be fair to the Bible Society, they're very clear about that in the report, and they point out that their previous figures from 2018 that they're comparing these ones with are also self-report figures. So a change in self-report figures may well be significant because you're comparing like with like. But the real criticism here is that they didn't look at, as you say, the much more objective data that is easily available of the Anglicans and the Catholics actually counting the people in the pews. And that makes me really question the extent to which this report is a even-handed attempt to get to the truth of the question of are there more people in church, or whether it's a more propagandist piece, because they didn't mention anywhere in this report the fact that there is actually quite robust data about how many people are actually in church. And I would think for them to actually engage with that research, at the very least, they could, for instance, have given a narrative about why they think that data undercounts the number of people in church. They could have tried to square somehow the figures they were getting with the contradictory figures in the other research, but they just don't mention, as far as I can tell, the fact that there is very good data that already exists that contraindicates the narrative that they're talking about. And then I guess the third thing is, what do they choose to focus on and lift up in their data, and what do they put to the back? As you said, one of the striking things for me about this data, as they do note themselves, is the finding that even fewer people identify as Christians in their 2024 survey than did in the 2021 census. And that's 39% among the general population, so less than 40% now, and 29% among the 18 to 34-year-old age bracket. Now, if another organization had written this report, that could easily have been the headline. YouGov poll finds lowest ever identification as Christians in probably recorded British history. I imagine that's the lowest figure ever that we've had. And yet that is a small note within a narrative that focuses much more on this self-reported attendance figure.
I think that's right. And I think that's a shame, because the little fact they've got, which, as you say, in the bigger context is a very small one, if they were less concerned about mounting their narrative and more concerned about actually finding out what's going on, is actually very interesting. Like, it is genuinely interesting if there has been even a small increase in 18 to 24-year-old men getting involved in Christianity or going to church. I mean, it's genuinely interesting change. You and I may see it as just a fluctuation in data at a very low level, which of course it is as well. But nonetheless, it is interesting, isn't it? You know, why should that be? How can we explain that? And that is an interesting question.
I do think that is interesting. And just to be very specific about the claim they're making or what they found in the data, they say that in 2018, when they did a similar survey, 4% of 18 to 24-year-olds said that they attended church at least monthly. So that's very few, and it's at least monthly, so it's very infrequent as well. So there's hardly any young people in church according to those figures. Today, they say in their current report, that's risen to 16%, and young men in particular, 4% to 21%, which is, if it's true, it's a quadrupling of the percentage of young men who are saying that they attend church at least monthly. And that, if that's true, that is a striking figure. Now, it's worth putting it in a bit of context, right? In the sort of modal church, if you imagine churches across the United Kingdom, what most of them actually look like and how many people come of different age groups, you're looking at a church with far less than 100 members, right? So a jump of 4% to 21% of young men in there, maybe like one young man is now coming. That's what that would actually look like. So it's very, very, very small numbers of people. But if it's true, it is an interesting shift. And it does align with some other things these commentators have been saying about how people have an openness to religious and spiritual narratives. So people have noted tons of the people who come to Jordan Peterson's talks about meaning in life are young men, right? He seems to particularly resonate with young men. Or Joe Rogan having more and more, who has a big audience among young men, more and more people on his podcast to talk about Christianity specifically and God in general. There does seem to be a cultural narrative shift that this is contributing to, of course, it kind of builds on itself, whereby there is an increased interest in religion and spirituality among young people. It's still very low, by the way. 4% to 21% is still like 4/5 of young men say, no, I don't go to church monthly. So it's very low. But that is a change. What's the reason? Why? Why are young men like this? I mean, I have to admit, I don't see it at the university where I work. Like, obviously,
I was going to ask that, yeah.
I have heard from some of our chaplains, so I work with a team of 15 chaplains. I've heard from our Catholic chaplain that engagement in our Catholic society is increased significantly this past year compared to previous years. But, and this is another thing we have to put in the back of our minds when we consider this research, this is all coming back off of COVID and the massive impact that had on everybody's social engagement and all the weirdness associated with that. And that happened in between these two reports. So it's difficult for me to know whether the increased engagement in some of our religious societies on campus, which one or two of them are reporting, is to do with, well, it's just bouncing back from the COVID dip back to people being more comfortable being in person again.
There is some of that, I think. But of course, that doesn't explain the 2018 to 24 change. There is, I think, when we looked at these figures, and when the colleague I talked about a moment ago looked at the figures, that obviously the COVID dip has almost resolved itself. It's almost the church attendance has almost returned back to where it would have been on a trend line compared with pre-COVID. So there is some of that going on, but of course it wouldn't affect the finding in the report. I think that it's. I think I'm right in that, aren't I?
Yes, I think you are. I was thinking mainly in terms of my experience at university.
Your experience at campus,
I don't know how much the change in, obviously, student societies go up and down year on year depending on how good their leadership is. It's a very bad measure of broader social trends. You can get no one year and a huge society next year because different people took over and they're better at marketing their events or whatever. Yes. So I wouldn't draw any conclusions from my experience of our Catholic society. I think it's just very difficult to tell on that level.
I think the report also, I mean, I do have some thoughts about this question that we're now onto, but before I say something about that, just to dwell again on the overblown nature of what the report claims to conclude from these figures. I mean, there's in the forward, I don't know whether you saw this, well, you did because you read the whole thing in great depth, but there's a forward, and it refers to the Matthew Arnold poem.
Yes.
About the sea of faith, and it's melancholy, long withdrawing roar, and says the tide has now turned, as if to imply that this is now faith has come
Yes.
faith has come surging back. I mean, whatever you think about that, clearly it's the Bible Society's job to try to turn the tide. So of course they've got a strong, as they see it, turn the tide. They've got a strong impetus towards that. But I mean, 9 in 10 people, 90% of people never go to church. 60% of people don't identify as Christian. So I mean, it's clearly a very overblown remark. And also, maybe there's just something really weird about the last 12 months. It might be that because they only ask, did you go to church monthly in the last year? Don't they? How often did you go to church in the last year? That's right. So I mean, maybe they haven't done this data every year. It's no long-term or even annual series of data here. So it might just be it's a really weird year, and there's a bit of interference with the numbers there. But if we say, well, there isn't, so there is, it's not just that there is something going on, then I think it's really possible. In fact, maybe it's even probable that in a world where, especially people who are younger, they're still reaping the economic whirlwind of the great crash in 2008. Their material circumstances have continued to decline. They're facing more and more the sort of social and economic and political conditions that we know from other countries and from history push people towards seeking a sort of structure and a sort of meaning as a response to their isolation and anxiety and loneliness. That they get pushed or push themselves towards or feel drawn towards these types of spirituality that are comforting and hierarchical and community driven. I don't feel the need to deny that is a phenomenon that happens. It does happen.
It does happen.
I think the solution to that personally is to improve everyone's economic and social and material conditions and give them all happier lives. But that is perfectly plausible to me that young people might be turning to these communities for that reason. And after all, Christianity in this country is extremely well funded, has a very impressive infrastructure of buildings, active, well funded, evangelism, promotion by social media influencers, continued privileged access even to our airwaves and to media and social media. One of the people at the launch of this was a person I've got a lot of respect and time for, Daisy Scalchi, who is involved in religion ethics in the BBC and is always a brilliant speaker on these topics. But one of the things she said was that, this data about young men would chime because we're finding more and more young men engaging in songs of praise. And I thought, well, there you go. I mean, not only are the buildings everywhere, but there's state-funded weekly proselytism on the television. So I mean, it would be a surprise if at least some people, in the face of these extraordinary, unprecedented decline in living standards and social, challenges of isolation, didn't turn towards these comforting to some people, structures. So I
think that's really key. Yeah,
surprised by that.
I feel like that combination of factors. I think there's a narrative that says, it's very popular out there, this is a sort of meaning crisis narrative, that our political problems, our economic problems, our challenges in culture, like culture wars and polarization and stuff like that, are due to some deep spiritual malaise because we've given up religion and the narratives that used to structure our lives, and so everything's falling apart. And if we return to those religious narratives, Christianity always is basically Christianity, then we'll fix these other problems. But I think that what you've just said is I think far more likely to be accurate. It's the other way round, which is that we are facing unprecedented political, economic and cultural upheaval, which is dramatically affecting particularly young people's material conditions, to get a bit Marxist about this. No, it is affecting their ability to buy a house, their ability to save for their future, their expectations about their quality of living. And that is producing a lot of anxiety. Like, they're seeing war in Europe for the first time in a long time. They're really experiencing, the rise of actual fascism in the United States. It's a scary and unsettling time to be alive. And I think that young people are responding to that by suddenly feeling a sense that, oh, I better find something secure that I can sort of hang my life on. And Christianity in this country has a huge amount of infrastructure that is there and basically empty, waiting for people and saying we've got a narrative that can respond to this. And I think it dovetails this research actually quite nicely with a theory about religion, which is, I think it's called existential risk hypothesis.
Yeah.
I think that's what it is, which is basically that religion becomes more salient in the lives of a society when those societies experience significant increases in existential risk. And the threats that we are facing, I think, do count as existential risks. And I think that's quite plausible that that's the direction of causality here.
I think that's true, but it's interesting if it is true, because, I mean, recently there was the big academic study that we've spoken about before, led by Lois Lee and other academics, into what makes people atheists in the UK, which is interesting, because I thought this odd thing... Yes, exactly. It's the devil that does it. But they found that this idea that you're more likely to become religious if you've got, insecurity, basically, economic and social insecurity, it makes you religious. They found that while that may well be an effect like you say, at the society level, country to country, it may be a factor. They didn't find that it was a factor in the UK for individuals. They found that it wasn't a factor actually, and that the greatest determinant was what your parents believed.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not such a big surprise, but it is interesting that until recently, at least, if let's say they did this, if your suggestion, which I sort of think might be true as well, that it is the existential condition of the young people face that might lead a very small number of them, like in this survey, to turn towards Christianity.
Yes, I think that's very interesting.
Turn towards church, because let's say
there
is. It's not the figures were interesting. Is that the number of people talking positively about Christianity wasn't higher. In fact, it was lower in the younger category. It was down in the younger people. So maybe we should take even the word Christianity out of it and say they claim they're going to church, whatever that might mean.
And so that's a really interesting way. So firstly, I take your critique of the existential risk hypothesis. That was a good piece of research, and it's interesting. It will be interesting to see if further research can tease apart why there seems to be a society-level effect of existential risk on religious participation or religiosity, but not an individual level. Because obviously, at some level, that's impossible. So there has to be something going on in that data that we need to tease apart. But I think what you've just said about pulling going to church aside from being a Christian might be a very interesting way to engage this data. Because, as you said, as the Bible Society accepts, although doesn't trump it, reduced percentages of people say they are Christian in their own research, including young people. It's not like more and more young people are saying they're Christian. Less are saying they're Christian. And yet, some apparently increased small percentage of young people are also saying they go to church. And that might speak to a desire among some people for the benefits of a church community or congregational participation without much enthusiasm actually about the church or the Bible specifically. Before we go into that, though, I think it's important, because we haven't talked about this, to address the extent to which this data might be affected by the very large amount of immigration we've had in this country since the last study. And I think that's something that they do too little to investigate. I mean, people, there's a bit of technicality to this, which people might be difficult to explain. But both of these studies, the 2018 study and the 2024 study, were weighted by ethnicity to make them representative of the ethnic makeup of the United Kingdom. But, and this is something you only find if you kind of dig into the report in some detail, the previous 2018 study was based on census data of the United Kingdom from 2011, whereas the most recent study was based on much more recent census data from 2021. So really, the weighting ethnically of the data goes from a 2011 weighting to a 2021 weighting, during which time there has been quite significant demographic changes in the United Kingdom, including very large waves of immigration. And that may well affect this data. What say you?
Well, I think we know that that must be true, because a survey from various evangelical organisations about 3 or 4 years ago, I think was looking particularly at the COVID period, but it found there was a huge point difference between the percentage of white people who said they were going to services, which is something like 19%, and the number of people from ethnicities other than white ethnicities, which was something like 48%. So, it was more than double the proportion. And like you say, since that time, there's been even more immigration. And of course, in the last 3 years, growing immigration from non-European sources, where people's religiosity tends to be higher. So I think that must account. My guess would be that would account for a sizable minority of the change. I don't think it could account for most of it. It certainly couldn't account for all of the change, because there simply is not enough. That numbers wouldn't do it. But it could easily account for, let's say, a minority of the change, maybe just under half. I think that then the figures start looking a lot different, of course. But
they do, and since we're talking about relatively small changes, except in those very small group of young people, the more of this that is attributable to immigration. And I think it's worth saying exactly why that matters. So my idea of a revival, when people say there's a religious revival in a culture, is that people who previously were not interested in religion or not religious become interested in religion or become religious. So it's a change within individuals from not being religious to being religious. That is what counts in my mind as a revival. Effectively, tons of people moving into a country who were already themselves religious and thus changing the demographics of that country doesn't count to me as a revival. That counts to me as demographic change. And I think that it's important, I don't know whether you agree with that, but I think it's important for people to see them as actually two different phenomena. And I think that there's another element to the immigration aspect of this that doesn't come out well in the report, because they seem to assume implicitly that all immigration to the United Kingdom that might be relevant to this question is people who aren't white. But actually, there has been large amounts of immigration of white immigrants from other parts of Europe, from countries which are dramatically more religious than the United Kingdom, particularly countries that are much more Catholic. And that is particularly interesting because they note that most of the growth in claimed church attendance is in Catholic and Pentecostal churches. Yeah. And so it looks like that will have a particularly significant effect.
Yes, and I think that's very interesting, because it's particularly worth noting that then that helps to explain the mismatch between people who say they're going to church and the fact that church attendance hasn't increased very much in practice, because of course then you'd be getting people from very Catholic environments for whom there is a strong social desirability of claiming in the survey that they do go to church, even if they don't, because they feel like it's a good thing to do, and therefore they say to the pollster that yes, absolutely, I do go to church at least every month. So I think that's a very, very, very good point.
I'm glad you picked that up. I think
they don't spend much time on that.
No, they should really tease this out, because it's important for our understanding of the actual situation rather than making a splashy narrative. But that point you made about, I don't know if there's any research into this question specifically, but my assumption is that people in cultures which are much more religious and where religious participation is much more encouraged simply by social pressure of other people doing it.
Oh, yeah.
People are not just more likely to be religious in those cultures, but they're more likely to claim to participate in religion when they don't. And there might be a very big effect there that needs to be investigated.
Absolutely. Will Gervais speaks very well about this, the academic. I think he's now relocated to the UK, but he's very good on the fact that in religious society, his work shows in religious societies, people say they're religious when they're really not. It's just the social pressure. I mean, this is obvious, I guess, from our own, not my experience, but from human experience, you can imagine that this is an effect that happens. Peer pressure, social conformity, all these obvious effects, but they are real, and there's good academic research to show that. So I think that's right. I think that the social desirability of saying, yes, absolutely, I go to church in a survey would definitely be higher for those people. But if we do sort of come back to explaining or thinking about a response to. I mean, that's the other interesting thing to do. What's our response as humanists to this data? I mean, it doesn't, the Bible side is obviously very clear that everyone becomes Christians, right? That's their sort of aim. I, on the other hand, don't want to make everyone a humanist. That's not the aim of my life. I want everyone to be happy and to, live the best life they can and find meaning where they do, and so on and so forth. So I'm not, if everyone, became a Christian tomorrow, I might think it was very odd that this happened. I might think it was very unlikely, and I might worry about what it might mean for our politics and for our society and so on. But, I wouldn't be against them doing so if that's really where they found truth and meaning and morality and all the rest of it. So I don't feel that's my long-winded way of saying I don't think I'm biased when I look at this data and say, okay, yeah, maybe unlike the Bible study, maybe there is something happening. I'm not against it happening. If it's happening, don't get me wrong. So let me just try and understand it and find a response. But so if I were to say, well, what would my response be? I think that I would say, well, we have to do something about this very atomized, lonely, anxious condition that many young people do find themselves in. And, one of my colleagues, not the data and analysing one, but another one, has written a piece about this that we're going to publish, I think, this week, where he says, humans are social animals. We need real people and real communities. Social media can't do it on its own. And if some people are finding, younger people are saying they go to church because of some community or imagined community, then that really just shows that there's a dearth of community, and we need to create more, and we need to find better ways of being together with other people in the real world. And I think that that's incumbent on all of us to do, isn't it, as a response to this sort of data. And what I said at the beginning just now was a way of me saying, and I'm not just saying that because I want to stop people becoming Christian. That's my point. I'm not saying, oh no, everyone's becoming Christian, we must make society better so that they don't become Christian. I'm saying, this is. I didn't want it to sound like that, and now I've said that, I've made it sound like that is what I'm saying. That is not what I'm saying. If people become Christian, that's fine by me. But if this social change that might be showing up in these statistics at a small low level is an indication of the atomization of society, such an atomization that is reversing a little bit of a recent trend, then that's concerning to me. It's a sign to me that we need to provide more and better communities everywhere for people, and so that people have the choice that they deserve. I think that's my own. That's how I felt. All things, having thought about it and considered it and thought everything I wanted to think about it, so far at least. My conclusion was, well, if this is happening, it seems like it's happening at a very low level, though the report has seriously overblown it. I suppose one of the things that it says to me is that, well, there really is a need for better and more communities where people will find these sorts of connections, and just a reminder that maybe young people do need that, and they are feeling atomized and anxious, and even to the extent that they're going to church. And so that's my takeaway from it.
I think you're absolutely right about that, and it takes us to that second strand of the research, which is more about the benefits people say that they experience from their religious communities. And here I think the Bible Society is actually on much stronger ground in terms of the social scientific evidence does consistently demonstrate that there are tangible benefits to being a member of a morally intense community.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. Obviously, the Bible Society doesn't say this part, but the research repeatedly shows that it doesn't matter if you believe what the religious community believes.
That's right.
Atheists who self-identify as atheists who attend church regularly seem to get all the benefits from that. And we know that because of really interesting longitudinal studies that ask the same people questions about their participation and health and things like that and their beliefs. And atheists who are married to a Christian who attend their spouse's church get all the civic and well-being benefits of going to church. So it's not about believing, it's about participation. But I think that it is important to recognize that there are benefits to being a member of a church community. They list in this report things like lesser depression, higher life satisfaction, less loneliness, and those are all in line with all the research I've seen into this question, including research by very serious social scientists who are not obviously motivated by promoting a particular religion. And I think that is something for humanists to take note of, because it has proven to be difficult to build and sustain communities for humanists. They do exist, and I wish there were kind of more of them. But I think that it does show, people, if you're listening to this and you're feeling lonely or bad mental health, or, you're worried about the future, anxiety and stuff like that, joining a community doesn't have to be a religious community. It can be a political party. It can be, a local pressure group or something like that, is very, very good for your health. And I still think humanists need to do better at building the infrastructure that enable people to have those benefits.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that I agree that there should be more local humanist communities. I agree with that completely. I also think there needs to be as large a possible a mixed ecosystem of positive communities, full stop,
Yeah.
Until very recently, I always said if I was asked this question or was giving talks about it or whatever, that we were very lucky in England to have, I think, I can't remember what the study was, but sometime in between 2008 and 2011, there was a study done of sort of the informal community sector in England, and it showed that it was really the largest and most diverse in Europe. Every evening up above every pub there was some group meeting or something. And I do get the sense, I mean, I don't think anyone's done that study since, and maybe there'd be no money in it now to do that study, because cohesion is less of interest, it seems, to policymakers. They're wrestling with other things, or rather, let me correct that. Good research about cohesion is less of interest to policymakers. But I get the feeling that is no longer the case. That we've gone from having actually quite a rich informal community sector to having far less of one, and the reasons are obvious, right? Because there's everywhere there's a decline in volunteering and free time, and both for economic reasons, but also COVID changed a lot of this. People go out less, and all the rest of it, especially in older demographics, and they might have to work longer because of the cost of living crisis than they had intended. So we're running out of retired people to sustain these community groups that used to, all the volunteers that used to be able to do this, people who were younger, maybe had time on their hands, now they've got to get straight into work, or they're not in work and so they don't go out. Anyway, whatever it might be, there's lots of reasons why that could be the case. But I think, as well as having good community groups for humanists built, because people want to spend time with other humanists and so on, and develop personally and connect with others, and hopefully also, as humanist groups should and do outward-facing social action as well to make things better for everyone, which they do. So they're all good things that people can do in a humanist group. But I personally think that there should just be more groups everywhere of every kind all the time doing these things, because the more connections that you can forge with other people, the better. And I think there's also some recent research. I've completely gone out of my head. I've been reading too much research, obviously, in the last few months. But I read some research. Too poorly read. If you can't remember what you've read, it's no good, is it? Some report about how psychologically healthy it was to have different roles in different contexts. So the more groups that you were a member of, and the more different roles that you had in those groups, sort of like the better it was for you, and for your healthy connections with others. And so that's quite an interesting.
I hadn't heard that. That facet of the research sounds really interesting. I'd love to.
I hope
read
I didn't just dream it. I might have. That would be a very boring dream that I was sitting there reading some research about social positioning and how.
Sounds thrilling to me.
But if I didn't dream it, it was definitely true. And so, but all of this is just to say yes, more community, more connection, more groups, more meaning, more purpose. More. And if this, the extent that people are finding healthy meaning from church in this way, if it is healthy and not the sort of Jordan Peterson style, Russell Brand type Christian belonging that young men might find on the internet.
Every time you mention Russell Brand, I see that photo of him in his knickers in the river getting baptized, and it's just the most ludicrous image.
Is it? Russell Brand. There you are. You've seen it.
Silly.
Repeatedly. Well, I actually am I take Russell Brand seriously. I think, it's... he's obviously having an enormous impact.
Yes, he's having a very baleful impact on the world, but he's such a
terrible
ludicrous figure.
And he obviously cares a lot about his Christianity, and so he's a very important Christian influencer now.
I think he cares that he's been able to rehabilitate his brand among some small segment of gullible people by claiming Christianity. That's what I think, but that's just my personal view.
I can't see into his brain, so I don't know whether
You're much kinder than I am.
Genuine or not. But I take him at face value, and I assume that he does mean what he said. And so, these are bad influences. But if this data suggests, or if this data means that people are actually finding meaningful, healthy, pro-social connections that will make them better citizens and people and make them happier,
yes.
Well, I'm fine. I'm fine with that. But I want everyone to have as many different options and opportunities in different groups as possible, and not just in one area of their life or in one particular religion or denomination. So, although I don't think the Bible Society's report was, a very fair-minded or accurate intervention into this discussion, I certainly don't have anything against the people who answered the survey and said that they were now going to church if they find that sort of healthy meaning in it.
I think that is a great way to wrap up our conversation about this report. This is a overblown rhetorical report that is trying to push a particular narrative that's obviously of direct benefit to the organization that wrote the report. It's based on some data that is itself actually quite interesting, with some features that are worth considering and taking seriously. There may well be some sort of shift in perception about religion and spirituality among young people, and particularly young men, that is leading some to at least say that they claim to go to church more often, and it's worth thinking about why that is. And there's good reinforcement in this report of the importance of community life and a strong civic culture where people can get together with others and engage with them in a variety of positive ways. And humanists should be attuned to that and think about how we can reverse the decline of our civil society and enable people to spend time with each other more and more frequently. But I don't think that we're looking at a quiet revival. So that's it for Deep Humanism. One more week. Thank you for joining us, and see you in the depths.